Hello, this is David Rovix hosting another live stream broadcast, which is appearing on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cebu Community Radio, and various other platforms. During the pandemic, since I can no longer tour and play music for a living, I've taken to broadcasting every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. On Mondays, it's an open mic, which I call Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, which folks are encouraged to sign up to participate in at davidrovix.com/POMM. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, I've been interviewing my friends for the most part and sort of publicly catching up with people who I might otherwise be hanging out with physically on a typical tour, if such things were still happening. On Tuesdays, however, the broadcast has an actual producer, longtime Detroit area talk show host and Fifth Estate magazine editorial collective member, Peter Werby. These days, Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that has been published in one form or another since its founding in 1965. You can read the entirety of the spring issue online at fifthestate.org. You can also subscribe to the print magazine there and hear previous episodes of Fifth Estate Live as well. Today, we're talking with André Naffis-Sahely, who is somewhere south of where I am in the state of California. André is a poet himself. In 2017, he published a book of poetry called The Promised Land, Poems from Itinerant Life. More recently, he has edited a book of fiction and nonfiction stories and poems from all over the world, from the ancient to the modern, on the theme of exile. André Naffis-Sahely, welcome to Fifth Estate Live. Great to have you. And before we talk about poetry and exile, or maybe not, but I mean, they might be intimately related to this next question. But and I know it's a huge question, but it's such are the times. Can you just catch us? So we'll start at the end here, in a sense. Can you tell us what's it been like for you there in LA in the past few weeks and months during the uprising and the pandemic?
Hi, David. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm a huge fan of your music, and I'm also grateful to the Fifth Estate team and Peter Werby in particular, who I've been corresponding with. LA, LA's been my home for 4 years, and it's a home I've grown to love very dearly. In fact, one of the things really that's kept me here is it's really rich and under-researched, under-discussed histories, particularly when it comes to labor rights and racial issues, which keep exploding, as we've seen over the past few weeks, and the homeless crisis, really. I think one of the things that we're seeing at the minute, and we were just discussing it a bit earlier, just between us, the fact that unfortunately eviction prevention notices are not being extended. I see a lot of talk about homelessness jumping through the roof in the next few months, but I see no talk at all about actually trying to do something about it. So it's a city that's suffering. Of course, half of it is Latino, half that's always abused and never really given a voice. They're bearing the brunt of this. People, as far as I can tell, in whichever neighborhood, because I was a stereotypical European or half European poet in some ways, that I never drove, and I only started driving when I moved to the U.S. to be with my wife, and specifically LA, because of course you can't get around without a car. So my wife and I actually went to protest in Boyle Heights, in Mariachi Plaza. And then drove around Beverly Hills as well, looking at what those wonderful kids and protesters were doing. And it felt very lively to be a part of that. It felt very invigorating, very inspiring, which you really need in copious amounts these days. But I think the actual reality that we're all facing in one way or another is really drastic. And so far, I really see no true efforts being made. I think Gavin Newsom's efforts were commendable in some aspects, but they're very time limited. And California's got deep-seated issues that are going to explode if you don't do anything about it. So that's my tuppence for now.
Right. I mean, having been there for 4 years, you already saw that it was a crisis. And when people talked about the crisis in California and in Oregon and in Washington and in New York, when they talk about the crisis, they're talking about the housing crisis, right? And now it's multiple other crises to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, because as we've seen, and I really want to give a shout out to local press here, because they really don't get enough attention. And a lot of the stories that where I get some of this information are only appear in local outlets. But as we've seen, even though for well over a decade there's been an understanding that more houses need to be built, you're looking at a lot of civic associations, neighborhood councils that actively vote against that. And what you're having there is white middle class people saying, no, the poor working classes and people of color aren't going to be able to have access to that kind of housing because we're going to refuse to build it. So, I think, all over LA, you see posters with the tagline, what are we doing about homelessness? Are we doing enough? And I think it's almost this rhetorical question that people ask themselves. We're playing this game where we talk a lot, but we don't really accomplish much. So that's,
yeah, and it seems like if anything ever gets done about homelessness in this country, it's always to cut regulation in order to allow for more construction, as if that's the only way to, as if rent control is just like a fantasy that can't actually be implemented in reality, despite the fact that many countries have rent control and have affordable housing.
Oh, absolutely right. I think that the only reason that housing construction has the prominent place it has is because we're refusing to look at all other options, including rent control. So it's seen as this cheap, easy fix. But let's face it, even that is not really being applied. I mean, Newsom passed this ordinance saying that motels, certain motels were to be given over to the homeless. A lot of them haven't been used for those purposes, and I'm really surprised at that. And I don't think there's actually been much coverage on why exactly that didn't happen, because that came straight from the governor's office. So again, we're seeing deep-seated resistance to any kind of change, even when it comes from the governor, say.
I know I don't know how many different countries have you lived in?
I've lost track somewhere along the way, but
you lost track of how many countries you've lived in. I mean, how many countries
Yeah.
you've actually had a place to live in, not just travel to.
Well, the ones that I've really spent, concerted amounts of time in. Italy, originally, I was born there for the simple reason that although my parents were living in the UAE at the time when I was conceived, they weren't married. And so the law there didn't allow unwed mothers to give birth. So my parents took me to Italy because that's where my mother's from. She's from Venice originally. So I spent about 5-6 years in Italy. I grew up in the UAE. That was about 12 years of my life. And I spent a long time in the UK, my 20s really, and now the US. I met my wife 5 years ago at a literary residency, and I left London at the time to move over here. So those would be the main 4 countries, really. But I spent a lot of time in Morocco. I translate a lot of Moroccan literature, so I lived there for quite a while. I spent a year in Fez. I spent various months in other cities, Tangiers, Marrakesh. I also spent a long time living in India, just because Abu Dhabi is this country that unofficially has adopted a form of apartheid. And so the majority of the population there is composed of South Asian workers. So I always thought of myself as, sure, I grew up in Arabia, but it was kind of little India. And
Right.
so I've always found myself quite familiar with Indian culture. And so, yeah, I've enjoyed living there, but that's been one of the other places I've spent time in.
In Abu Dhabi, did you actually pick up any Punjabi or Bengal or anything like that, or do all the South Asian workers communicate with everybody in English, or what's it like in terms of the language situation?
Well, as you might imagine, I mean, it's wonderfully cosmopolitan when it comes to languages. I think it's as diverse as New York City or any other city around the world that's known for its diversity. The South Asians there, because things are so restricted, they're not. When it comes to certain physical locations in the city, they are not even allowed to enter, say, certain shopping malls that they themselves helped build.
Wow.
And so, yeah, there's great divisions, meaning that when it comes to public life, really, people will converse in English or Arabic. Those are the languages of commerce, of education, of government. So they will talk their own languages amongst themselves, but when it comes to the public, they will mostly talk to them in English and Arabic. So whenever I talk to people of that background, it was usually in English or Arabic. I picked up a few words here and there because I think there's a bit of a Marathi patois in some ways, where you throw in various words from various languages, usually cribbed from English or Arabic, but with this, wonderful extensions to them. But I was actually lucky. I picked up Arabic, unlike a lot of foreigners, because when I was very young, the government had this very good idea, which was to make sure that all children, regardless of background, if they grew up in the country, had to take compulsory Arabic lessons. So I picked it up at the right time, and even though I haven't used it in years, I still retain enough of it.
Yeah. And did you grow up in the household speaking Farsi and Italian, or just?
No, Farsi was a language that I was always immersed in because my father would use it with family or occasional or friends or business acquaintances. There's a lot of Iranians who live in the UAE. Also, a lot of Emiratis are of Iranian background because it's a very mixed society. There was a lot of interaction between Iraq and Iran and India. And so what one would consider the Emirati culture is not just purely based on Arabian Bedouin kind of roots, but it's mixed there as well. I never picked up Farsi. My father refused to teach me the language. He was exiled out of Iran in 1979. He belonged to a fringe communist group. And things went pretty badly for him there. He was escorted to the airport by 15-year-olds with Kalashnikovs, and he was lucky to actually.
And he was one of the lucky ones.
Exactly, he was one of the lucky ones because, as far as I'm aware, he never really opened up to me about these things. But as far as I'm aware, most of the people he knew were executed. And so he was quite lucky. There's a story to that luck, but I think he, as many people do in those situations, he experienced deep personal trauma and just could not impart the language. I grew up reading Iranian poetry, but it was always in Italian or English, and so I've always been exposed to the culture. But it's not Farsi isn't one of my languages.
Wow. You know, when people talk about cities like Los Angeles or New York and these or London or these well-known international cities full of people from all over the world, the sort of like the discourse that we grow up with in this country is this idea that somehow everybody wants to live in New York or everybody wants to live in London, and I grew up with this idea that New York is this amazing international place, and that's great, which it's great, but in the sense that you have everybody from around the world. But it wasn't until I was well into adulthood that I started to realize that most of the people from around the world that live in places like New York and LA actually don't want to be there, and they'd rather be home, and they left home because they had to. Is that your just riff on that? Is that your did you figure that out a long time before I did, or
Well, I don't know about that. I'll say that it took me a while, despite the fact that I was living right in the heart of it. I think that speaks also to the relatively privileged situation that I was in. So I came to it as a realization, but I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. In fact, there have been many times when I've referred to going to the UAE for example, for these South Asian workers, whether they're from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India, Pakistan, Nepal, as a minor Arabian dream, a riff on the American dream, where they don't want to be there. They know that they're being exploited. For many years, it was considered absolutely normal standard practice to import these workers on false promises. On arrival, strip them of their passport, every notion of civic rights that one may have, including the right to strike, the right to unionize, all of which is legal. There's no freedom of press. They would confiscate their passports, pay them maybe a tenth of what had been promised. And because of being stuck in that cycle, they would spend 10, 20 years. And many of them just never made it back. Because guess what? If you're working 12-hour shift in the desert, you will have a heart attack at some point. And cardiac arrest is one of the high figures of death there. Also because there's not much scrutiny when it comes to safety standards and construction sites. And, outside of oil, really, in countries of the Gulf, these petrocracies, they primarily, as the name implies, rely on oil, but at the same time, local industries, it's really all about construction, education, tourism. And so there's the system of exploitation that's fed by these desperados, regardless of where they come from, really. Because I think when it comes to capital truly knows no color in that way. They will suck up and crush anyone that they deem fit to be profitable in some way or another. And so I think that fixating on the image of wonderful eclectic cosmopolitanism in these cities really does something to cover these realities. And in fact, let's face it, a lot of these people who make these cities function can't really enjoy what makes these cities special in the first place. So, we're talking about layers of exclusion here. So I agree. And I think it applies to Abu Dhabi, just like it applies to Hong Kong or Singapore and New York or LA, you name it.
And you come here, and you in LA, you see the similar kinds of dynamics, especially with black and brown workers and undocumented, perhaps especially, but also because of institutional racism, as is being now actually talked about in the mainstream media. It's certainly not at all limited to undocumented workers, but perhaps especially, and there's so many around LA, and it's but in Abu Dhabi, how do they actually keep workers from going into the malls? I mean, what is that? How do they I mean, it's officially not an apartheid state, right? So how do they get around that?
Well, it's a part by consent, and I won't. This is one of the phrases I basically attempted to come up with because the issue really hasn't been discussed as much as it should have. So some of these terminologies I'm trying to improvise as I go along. When I say apartheid by consent, is because one of the standard lines that's used against anyone at all who decides to criticize this system, including Emiratis themselves, by the way, because the UAE has jailed a lot of human rights activists and lawyers that belong to their own tribes, to their own people. From that point of view, they tell you, well, yes, this is a system of unofficial apartheid. Every caste has its jobs. South Asians are in the construction industry. East Asians are used as domestic servants and horribly abused. And Europeans fill managerial posts, and the Emiratis are right at the top, constituting this elite. If you have a problem with that, then you shouldn't be here, because everyone who comes here with the premise, understanding that very premise. So that's why I call it apartheid by consent. And quite often in newspapers, when they've been dealing with international criticism of local policies, they say something along the lines of, well, if you don't like it, leave. I mean, I got told that so many times when I was growing up there that I even ended up using it in my poems, because that's the reality. So I think, they've done something that's pretty clever, which is enact this wonderfully restrictive system, but at the same time, not codify it, not publicize it, so as to avoid the international attention that South Africa received for that half century. So I think they've been very clever about it. Unfortunately, I think that it's an issue that's really not being discussed as much as it should have. But just to underscore the situation with malls. So when it comes to construction, again, South Asian workers do the overwhelming majority of the work. But you then have these situations where South Asian security guards employed by the malls, when they're finished, are told to keep anyone who doesn't look like they have money or social standing outside. So there's nothing officially keeping them out, but the security guards basically look at these crowds who think, well, after a year of building the shopping mall, I might want to walk inside it, get some respite from the heat, enjoy the air conditioning, right? But they're prevented from doing so. So they're quite literally barred from entering premises that they built with their own hands. And of course, none of this makes the newspapers, but that's because, there's censorship. So.
Did you? I mean, you were born in the UAE? You actually spent your first 12 years there, like uninterrupted 12 years?
No, so my parents were working in the UAE when I was conceived, as they told me as a kid. In one of those awkward moments, they say, "Let us tell you about where you came from."
As long as they don't give you more details than that. Then,
exactly, that's absolutely right. They always kept it sweet and PC. But but they were living there. They had no intention of leaving. They wanted me to be born in Abu Dhabi. That's where they were living. But they weren't married at the time. My father was still going through a lot of difficulties with paperwork because it took him many years as essentially a political refugee to get an Italian passport. He was only able to do that through help from my mother's sister, actually. And it took many years. So they weren't married, and they only married when I was about 5 years old. And because my mother was an unwed woman, the law of the UAE at the time said unmarried mothers cannot give birth in this country, so they have to go back to their country of origin. So they went back to Italy, intending to come right back. They ended up staying a few years, but I spent the majority of my childhood from the age of 5 or 6 up until the age of 19 in the UAE. So that's really the place that shaped me the most.
Did you feel like an exile yourself from a certain age? Did you identify with this concept, or have you ever felt like you belonged somewhere? I mean, like as a traveler, I've spent about half of my adult life traveling, and much of that outside of this country. And the more I do, the more I feel like I'm kind of at home everywhere and nowhere. And and I think I think you do know what I'm talking about, but it's different for everybody depending on their particular experiences. And for me, the traveling although I grew up in a very, in the New York area, so lots of exposure to the rest of the world, but the traveling didn't start until I was an adult. But
Yeah,
I wonder, do you feel at home everywhere and nowhere, or is more emphasis on everywhere or more emphasis on nowhere, or how would you say?
you know what? I think it's usually, apart from rare moments of depression, well, not so rare. I think that
Increasingly common in the past few months,
increasingly common,
perhaps?
absolutely, indeed.
Yeah.
Outside of moments of depression, I've always thought absolutely emphasis on everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think awkward as word as it is, I do consider myself cosmopolitan from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I think the political system is tilting towards nowhere at the minute, which is why we're feeling the way I do. And look, I think exile is it can be political, it can be spiritual, it can be stemming from a variety of reasons. I think because of my father's background and past, his politics, I always felt that there was an exilic tradition within the family,
Yeah.
if you will. So I think that was always part of it. And then economic exile in various ways. My mother's father, my maternal grandfather, was one of many men who helped build the Mont Blanc tunnels, connecting France with Italy. So these were
Mm-hmm.
men who went around with, this was the early 1950s, they went around with sticks of dynamite, blowing up sections of forest and rock so that the engineers could come in and carve out this feat of modern engineering. And he was someone who left the area around Venice because there was no work at the time in the immediate wake of World War II. So he was in an economic exile of sorts, as is very common these days. In terms of myself, I think I was never made to feel at home in Italy at all. I mean, most of my memories of that time are heavily linked to racism.
Really?
Yeah, I think, part of my father's a lot darker skinned than I am. And so I often noted that the behavior of certain people and how it would change. I mean, quite often he was asked whether I was actually his son because I was white, unlike him. I mean, we look exactly alike, but the randomness of genetics means that although I look exactly like my father, I've taken my mother's white skin. So I think Italy is incredibly insular, has been for a long, long time. And part of that, was the result of being invaded by every power in Europe for about 1,000 years. So it created this insular culture where they don't like the people from the next village over. So someone like me never stood a chance, I think. So in the UAE, I found myself, sure, in exile. I think, I've looked at various texts where sociologists call people like me third culture kids. I don't really agree with that kind of terminology. I think, like we were saying earlier, you say the city cosmopolitan and it sugarcoats the reality, which is instead very different. But the UAE gave me a chance to connect with people from all over the world. And in a way, I think it saved me. I think had I stayed in Italy, I would have ended up quite badly. And my parents always said that too, adding to the feeling that, yeah. So I think, going to that culture, even though it was, as I said, very deeply politically problematic, I saw the kind of, Marxist class relations that more closely resembled Dickens's London than what one would think normal society should be these days. But at the same time, it did expose me from people all over the world. Yeah.
Do you have your poem "Vanishing Act" handy?
I do. Let me just pull it up.
I know it's a rant. I didn't ask you about that before, but I just
Yeah, no,
would you do that for us?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Got it right here, actually. Yeah, and yeah, good choice given what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So this poem's called "Vanishing Act." Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi. The rest simply fail to have their visas renewed. They are bagged, tagged, and placed on the next available flight back to wherever they came from. The one-way ticket experience par excellence. Every edifice on this island is crafted by these almost nothings. Their solace in death, at least, is to never again queue for whole days on end, to have their fingertips inked and pressed by intolerant hands, their blood screened for undesirable illnesses, their flesh seared by a sun that wonders what the hell they're doing there.
You are listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cebu Community Radio. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate print magazine. We're talking with André Naffis-Sahely, poet and editor of the 2019 collection of poems and stories about exile, Heart of a Stranger. And you selected several pieces from the amazing collection, which is so vast and covers so much ground from the ancient to the modern, as it says in the introduction. But I mean, I was completely overwhelmed with the prospect of trying to choose a few pieces. So I was really glad that you did that. But can you give us? Can we go through those and talk about them and these selections? And can you just introduce the first one and
Sure.
read it for us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, just to unpack the title, I might start with, a very short one here, which is was where I took the title. And this is an excerpt from the Torah, Exodus, from the book of Exodus 23:9. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that was the inspiration for the title of the book, which essentially, although I wound up being a writer, I studied the history, so I'm a historian by formation, and this book ended up being really a very biased, a very personal miniature history of human civilization, but specifically told through the stories of the people that we kick out of civilization. Because one of the I think, I don't know if it's quite original. I think it's being so obvious that others have commented on it. But you cannot really have civilization without exile. You cannot form a community without eventually excluding someone else. I think in history we seem to have done that repeatedly over and over. So the pieces that I picked in this book were also chosen not just for their historical value, but for the practical information that they can give us. I think one of the earliest poems that I picked for the book is by the Kurdish poet Kajal Ahmed, and it's entitled "Birds." It's translated from the Kurdish by Choman Hardy and Mimi Kalvati, both fantastic poets in their own right. Yeah, I'd love to read it if I may.
Please, yes.
So this is Kajal Ahmed, and the poem is entitled "Birds." According to the latest classification, Kurds now belong to a species of bird, which is why, across the torn, yellowing pages of history, they are nomads spotted by their caravans. Yes, Kurds are birds. And even when there's nowhere left, no refuge for their pain, they turn to the illusion of traveling between warm and cold climes of their homeland. So, naturally, I don't think it's strange that Kurds can fly. They go from country to country and still never realize their dreams of settling, of forming a colony. They build no nests, and not even on their final landing do they visit Melawana to inquire of his health, or bow down to the dust in the gentle wind like Nali. And again, this was translated from the Kurdish by Choman Hardy and Mimi Kalvati. This was one of the poems that was produced by the Poetry Translation Center, which is based in London. And actually, the book is the Heart of a Stranger, is dedicated to the founder of that center, Sarah McGuire, who passed away in 2017, but who for just about 15 years created one of the very few venues which allowed poets of this kind and translators of that kind to actually be able to work on these great translations and promote their work. Because I think, Western literature culture has always been very resistant to translations from outside European languages. And I think that center provided a lot of support. But yeah, that's one of the earliest poems that I picked for the anthology. The Kurds, of course, as you know, as many of us will know, are the world's largest stateless people. They're scattered amongst various countries, all of whom have, been intolerant towards them in one shape or form. And so I think, yeah, it was an important poem to select.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, which I guess I'd never really thought about, was how so many of the people exiled are not poor and oppressed people necessarily, but actually wealthy and powerful people who get exiled as well. And that was an interesting sort of twist. And I don't know, in Italy, I have there's this tradition you also mentioned in the book, which I've recently read about in a biography of of Luigi Galliani, of the anarchist, wonderful Italian anarchist, and the tradition, which, as you point out, ended in, I guess, in the early 40s, of exiling people on islands which had very few people living on them, and this was just about the worst punishment aside from executing somebody, was to send them to an island, which today just seems kind of weird because everybody wants to live on a on a island paradise with their yacht and whatever, which is what these islands are more like now, I guess, more like resorts, but they were not resorts 100 years ago when Galliani was exiled to one of them.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And I'll start with perhaps the most important part, which I think, yes, absolutely. A lot of wealthy people have been exiled, and I think those are exactly the people that should be exiled. I think we should, especially these days, take a page from the Athenians, who developed the notion of ostracism, right, where wealthy individuals who, as usual, always try to not just attain political office, but retain it for the rest of their life, essentially become dictators. Those were the very people the Athenians would exile. Everyone would write down the name of the person they wanted exiled on a piece of broken pottery, and then they would tally up the numbers. So exile, in a way, at least as the Athenians conceived it, was kind of an early Survivor-style reality TV show, where the people that were deemed most harmful to the public good, and again, we should keep this message in mind, especially these days, they were usually wealthy, corrupt men, and those were exactly the people that were usually exiled because they were deemed to have too much of a negative influence on society. And so 5 years of cooling off somewhere else would be the punishment they inflicted on them. And one thing that's also important to keep in mind is that a lot of these people would also be welcomed back, especially if they reformed their views and ways. So exile has that very particular history. The Greek colonists in Magna Graecia in southern Italy had the same practice, but instead of broken pieces of pottery, they used leaves of olive trees. So I think exile's being redefined every single second according to where it's situated and the culture that has embraced the notion. In terms of the island style exiles, one of the famous ones being Napoleon as well, right? First in is it Elba and then Santa Elena. I think that that was a practice that went back right to the Roman emperors. So in Italy, the undesirables of whatever stripe were sent, to these islands. But I think that there's, even though there's a sense in which this was meant to be a punishment, I think it's interesting to know, and this is one of the things I tried to talk about in the book through the selection of texts, is that exile it can often have very unintended consequences. So the manifesto that was used as one of the founding documents for the creation of the EU, regardless of what we think about it politically, at the time that manifesto was basically saying, after thousands of years of war, we Europeans should unite and not fight one another anymore. That was written by a political exile who had been sent to one of the islands in Italy, one of the Ventotene Islands. And so banishing, and when Mussolini banished Cesare Pavese, Pavese ended up writing some of the greatest poetry that century. And I think he was, very much an anti-committed fascist. So I think Mussolini indirectly propped up Pavese as one of the country's left-leaning intellectuals. So I think exiling someone usually starts with the premise that if you can get rid of someone, you will get rid of the problem. But I think history very delightfully teaches us that you can get rid of the individual, but you can't get rid of the idea. You can't get rid of the inevitable change that has to come. So I think, it was one of the pleasures that seeing that exile isn't the finality that some people think it is.
And I wonder, do you have much? I guess the thoughts between the parallels between exile and prison. I mean, prison is like exile in a form of internal exile, which also tends to sometimes produce the same results. Like some of the greatest books ever written were written by people in solitary confinement.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think a lot of these texts, I mean, one of and I might read this next. One of the earliest texts alongside that poem I read earlier that I picked was an excerpt from Emma Goldman's memoirs. And I listened to
Oh,
the
let's have
wonderful
that.
show on Goldman. And I think, she was being deported here, but I think you're right. I think exile and prison are often indistinguishable. So here's Emma Goldman as she is being boarded essentially on the USS Buford, and with J. Edgar Hoover watching by the side of the dogs, probably rubbing his hands, admiring his handiwork. So here we go. We were led to a cabin. A large fire roared in the iron stove, filling the air with heat and fumes. We felt suffocating. There was no air, no water. There then came a violent lurch. We were on our way. I looked at my watch. It was 4:20 a.m. on the day of our Lord, December 21, 1919. On the deck above us, I could hear the men tramping up and down in the wintry blast. I felt dizzy, visioning a transport of politicals doomed to Siberia, the atop of former Russian days. Russia of the past rose before me, and I saw the revolutionary martyrs being driven into exile. But no, it was New York. It was America, the land of liberty. Through the porthole, I could see the great city receding into the distance, its skyline of buildings traceable by their rearing heads. It was my beloved city, the metropolis of the New World. It was America, indeed America, repeating the terrible scenes of Tsarist Russia. I glanced up, the Statue of Liberty. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a knife to the heart. Yeah.
Indeed. And great woman, but great writer too, really.
Yeah.
Truly a phenomenal writer.
Yeah.
Politics aside.
This the period there as a historian, it's a fascinating process going from studying history to getting into the whole world of poetry. And it's I feel a lot of kinship there. But when Emma Goldman was deported, and along with so many others at that time after the Palmer raids, it's and then even before the Palmer raids, when was I believe just before that, when they passed the Alien and Sedition Act,
Right.
and then so many different anarchist publications just ceased to publish immediately, right? Like Galliani's publication, he just wrote one last thing saying, actually publishing in Italian the act that had just been passed, the Sedition Act that had just been passed in Congress, and basically said, we can't publish anymore. This is now no longer even a semblance of a democracy, and we can't publish, and bye bye. But it kind of reminds me of the law that was just passed in Hong Kong, and then all these Hong Kong exiles. There's I think, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of them in Vancouver, BC, and all over the world. But it just strikes me as a sort of interesting comparison there. I don't know. You got anything from any Hong Kong exiles in the book?
No, I didn't actually. And part of the reason for that was because work was promised but not delivered. That was a reality, unfortunately, that happened with a few people. I mean, I gotta say, I think the more dangerous the climate, the more there was a risk that the contributor would wind up badly in one way or another. I can't name names specifically for obvious reasons, but that was the case. I mean, one of the authors I was actually dealing with passed away during the process of the book. And I had to deal with the author's brother and the estate. And this is someone who'd been exiled from Bhutan, like many of the Lhotshampa communities. So it's putting the book together was I think a necessary refresher course in what privilege really means, in the sense that, white writers, European writers, Western, they deliver their work instantly. The rest, it took years of work, and quite often it didn't turn up. Yeah, so it was a reminder of the difficulties they face, and just speak their minds, really.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just whenever people tell me that they think I'm brave for speaking my mind, I always think, gosh, you really need to look around outside of to places where they, like what happened to the guy, the Oromo writer in Ethiopia, the songwriter who just got shot to death last night. Like that's this is that doesn't happen so often here to artists.
Well, I think, you're right, but I think it also does happen over here. I mean, part of the reason that that I included so many texts from the first Red Scare is because I think we're in a third one. We're in a third
Mm-hmm.
one. I
Yeah,
think that the
and now
president
there's a lot
declared
of people.
Antifa a terrorist
Yeah,
organization,
yeah,
but
they're
somehow the
firing
Proud
into
Boys
protest.
don't. Yeah, and somehow the Proud Boys don't fit into that category. One of the cases I followed was a shooting at the University of Washington campus where right-wing activists who had gone on campus armed with the intent of starting a fight to then shoot someone were basically let off the hook because even though they shot someone in the belly, that person survived. So, no harm done. So I think, dangerous things can happen to people who speak out. Even in our societies here, the ones we're living at the moment. I think this might actually be a good setup for that Bisbee poem
Oh,
because I
good.
think,
Yeah. Oh, Bisbee. Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Come
yeah,
on. Yeah.
because I
Let's
think
hear that.
a lot of these
The
people
Bisbee
were
deportations that most people have never heard of are crazy. They just took all these people to the desert and left them there to die.
exactly, and a lot of them, were Americans. There were a lot of international people in there. Of course, this
It
being
was the
Arizona,
IWW, so it was the
exactly.
Industrial Workers of the World. So it was probably at least 60, 70% immigrants, right?
That's exactly right. A lot of them obviously south of the border because we're talking about Arizona. But yeah, this is a poem where we can't share the author's name simply because we don't know it. All I can tell you about the author's identity is that they are referred to as card number 512210. So that was the union card number attached to the poem when this was published in the One Big Union Monthly, the in-house publication of the IWW. And the poem is simply entitled Bisbee. It was published 2 years after the deportation of 1917. Bisbee. We are waiting, brother, waiting, though the night be dark and long. And we know 'tis in the making, wondrous day of vanished wrongs. They have herded us like cattle, torn us from our homes and wives. Yes, we've heard their rifles rattle and have feared for our lives. We have seen the workers, thousands, march like bandits down the street. Corporation gunmen around them. Yes, we've heard their trampling feet. It was in the morning early of that fatal July 12th, and the year 1917, this took place of which I tell. Servants of the damned bourgeois, with white bands around their arms, drove and dragged us out with curses, threats to kill on every hand. Question, protest, all were useless to those hounds of hell let loose. Nothing but armed resistance would avail with these brutes. There they held us, long lines, weary, waiting beneath the blazing desert sun. Some with eyes bloodshot and blary wished for water, but had none. Yes, some brave wives brought us water. Loving hands and hearts were theirs, but the gunmen, cursing often, poured it out upon the sands. Down the streets in squads of 50 we were marched, and some were chained, down to where shining rails stretched across the sandy plains. Then in haste with kicks and curses, we were herded into cars, and it seemed our lungs were bursting with the odor of the yards. Floors were inches deep in refuse, left there from the western herds. Good enough for miners, damn them, may they soon be food for birds. No farewells were then allowed us, wives and babes were left behind, though I saw their arms around us as I closed my eyes and wept. After what seemed weeks of torture, we were at our journey's end, left to starve upon the border, almost on Carranza's land. Then they rant of law and order, love of God and fellow man, rave of freedom over the border, being sent from promised lands. Comes the day, we'll remember, sure as death relentless too, grim-lipped toilers, their accusers, let them call on God, not you.
Damn.
Ah.
You're listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cebu Community Radio. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate print magazine. We're talking with André Naffis-Sahely, poet and editor of the 2019 collection of poems and stories about exile, Heart of a Stranger. André, I just, when I was looking up, researching you online before we talked, I first of all realized I already had read a whole bunch of your wonderful poems that you've written, but also I discovered that we have a whole lot of friends in common, including the poet Rory Waterman, who lives in Scotland, and you also went to school at St. Andrews or graduate school at St. Andrews in Scotland?
Yeah, that was graduate school. That was just for 1 year. Yeah, that's
just
right.
For a year. But I have been there before, and not to the actual college, but I've been to what was it? A nearby city, a small city nearby there, where you can, when you get on the top of the hill in the city.
Dundee, by any chance?
Dundee, yes. In Dundee, I was, and then you get on the top of the hill, and then you can see St. Andrews in the distance, and it just looked like a very remote, in a very sparsely populated place called Scotland, in a very remote part of Scotland, and that must have been a bit of a contrast from living in places like LA and Abu Dhabi.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, I think it was, perhaps the quintessential example of these cloistered European academic little cities that just, outside of term time are basically depopulated. One of the very striking things is that this ruined cathedral still stands in the midst of this little town on this rocky cliff. So you couldn't really picture, especially in winter, where, I think it was... I can't remember who, but it was a Scottish comedian that said it gets so dark that the trees grow towards you if you're wearing a bright, colorful sweater. That the weather is so bad that you can picture a more gothic place. So it quite a contrast to the places where I'd lived. I mean, I'm really quite a city rat. I've never really lived in places that were very rural, but I enjoyed my time there. I went there specifically to study poetry. I had some wonderful teachers there. Yeah, and it was only later that I moved to London, and where I started hanging out with Rory, who's a great friend of mine, great poet too.
Mm-hmm. Did you run across much about the exiling of the Highlanders and how I think there was a refugee camp in Glasgow in the 1890s that had 100,000 people in it waiting to board boats to North America?
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I saw a few texts that I thought might make the cut, but none of them that were quite to the literary standard that I wanted for the book. Because I think that was an element where, because the book is so political, I needed for there to be certain literary standards in place, which is why Goldman, for example, was such an easy selection for me to make, because she's such a wonderful writer, and I think related things very clearly. I think the documents I saw were very limited, but I think, both the Scots and the Irish had these great moments of exile, deportation, always caused by outsiders, usually the English, really. I mean, one of the I would say more lyrical poems, but one that is still, let's say, the document of a national tragedy was The Flight of the Earls, which basically talks about that's what it's referred to historically as the flight of the Irish Earls, when the Gaelic, let's say the cream of the old Gaelic aristocracy went into exile in various other Celtic parts of Europe to try and basically form an alliance to drive the English out of their lands. But what actually happened is that, because Ireland was deprived of leadership at a critical moment, that was very much the first step that led to then the plantation of Ulster and all the forced relocation and murders, really, that happened as a result. So I think that was very much an example of how going into exile can be a bad idea. And I think that's one of the things I tried to do with the book, where every piece tries to portray a dimension of exile, whether it can work out well for some or work out badly, and everything in between.
Can you give us another of your selections?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. One of the poem I'd like to read now is by an Iranian American poet named Kaveh Basiri. And the poem I'm actually about to read, I've spoken to a correspondent of Kaveh recently, and it's the title of a prize-winning pamphlet, which I recommend you all go out and find. And the poem, again, is the same title as the pamphlet, and it's called 99 Names of Exile. And this was also one of the first texts I selected for the anthology. 99 Names of Exile. Adam and Eve, afflicted, afraid, alien, banished, beggar, castaway, colonist, condemned, crippled, dangerous, dark, deportee, deserter, detested, different, dirty, disgraced, disinherited, dismissed, disowned, displaced, dispossessed, dyke, immigrant, ethnic, evil, exotic, expatriated, expelled, extraterrestrial, foreign, forsaken, fugitive, guilty, heretic, homeless, homesick, impure, infectious, inhuman, insurgent, invisible, Ishmael, Jew, Kashmiri, lost, malefactor, marooned, mysterious, nigger, non-citizen, non-conformist, other, unrecognized, unskilled, unspeakable, unthinkable, untouchable, unusual, unwanted, unwilling, unworthy, victim, villain, virus, wanderer, witch, wrong, X, yellow, zero. And again, that's by Kaveh Basiri, who wonderful poet and translator. And yeah, he's got a prize-winning pamphlet out there, same title, 99 Names of Exile.
What was it written in English originally?
I believe so, yes.
It sounds like, I mean, just seems like it just strikes me as a very difficult poem to try to translate. But if you were to try to translate it into any other language, works really well in English though.
Yeah. And you know, again, this is something that I want to underscore. You know, putting together a book like this relied on, you know, the generosity of fellow artists and translators who, you know, whether they asked their publisher to waive away fees because there was no budget for the permissions that they asked, which is just as well, because, you know, I didn't want to spend $1,000 on a poem by W.H. Auden. This book was conceived with the idea of emphasizing poets like the ones I read from today rather than that usual canon. And so a lot of this couldn't have been put together without them. I actually found Kaveh's poem in an anthology by Sholeh Wolpe, another Iranian American poet who also contributed to the book. She's actually in the book twice over, both as a poet in her own right and as a translator. So
the last name, that's not an Iranian last name, is it?
I'm not quite sure as to the origin of the name, but she's very much Iranian.
Interesting, because my father's Wolpe.
Yes, that's right. With an accent on the E. Yeah.
Yeah. That's my father's composition professor at Long Island University was a German Jew named Volpe with the same last name. I don't know if.
Okay. Maybe there's something there. I'll ask Sholeh.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where there's all kinds of possible relationships there, but who knows? But yeah, give us another. You got one more?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I actually thought would be fun to read, just because we've looked at a lot of contemporary work, and I thought maybe dip us back in the more ancient sections of the anthology. And I wanted to read a few lines from a letter written by the Stoic philosopher Seneca, where he talks about exile in a more philosophical vein. Now, here's what he says. And when you say nothing that is indifferent is glorious, I grant you this much, and declare that nothing is glorious except as it deals with indifferent things. I classify as indifferent, that is neither good nor evil, sickness, pain, poverty, exile, and death. None of these things are intrinsically glorious, but nothing can be glorious apart from them. For it is not poverty that we praise, it is the man whom poverty cannot humble or bend. Nor is it exile that we praise. It is the man who withdraws into exile in the spirit in which he would have sent another person into exile. It is not pain that we praise. It is the man whom pain has not coerced. One praises not death, but the man whose soul death takes away before it can confound it. All of these things are in themselves neither honorable nor glorious. but any one of them that virtue has visited and touched is made honorable and glorious. So I think that that's a good reminder for basically trying to abandon certain preconceived notions like good and evil, and to really approach the lives of these exile through their writing. And I hope I did that. I think one of the poems also that I always carried with me in Italian, but I ended up finding this fantastic translation by James Finn Cotter, and it's a translation of a canto from Dante's Paradise, to counterbalance Seneca's very bleak outlook on the world, but also comforting.
Good.
Let's hear it. And this is basically, I like to think that Dante's Divine Comedy, if he'd written it today, it would be one of the most bitter blogs known to humanity, because it was his way of saying, well, he and the other person have wronged me, so I'm going to put him in this specific circle of hell and make him suffer this torture. And I think in Paradise, in rare moments, you have Dante actually being honest with himself. And talking about himself, although in a veiled manner. And nowhere does he do so more than in this particular canto, where he's basically visited by an ancestor of his who says, you may like to wag your tongue and think that exile won't break you, but trust me, exile will break you. And these are the lines from that poem. You shall leave everything most dearly loved. This is the first one of the arrows which the bow of exile is prepared to shoot. You shall discover how salty is the savor of someone else's bread, and how hard the way to come down and climb up another stairs. And what will weigh down on your shoulders will be the bad and brainless company with whom you shall fall down into this ditch. So very, very stark words there.
That's
I think.
Stark.
Yeah, after having spent the entirety of the Inferno castigating his rivals and enemies, I think this is where Dante really lets his guard down and starts talking about his own difficulties. So it felt like an important addition.
How hard was it to find a publisher for this? I'm just curious about the logistics of that, because I mean the publishing industry is in a state of collapse, and I don't think collections of poems are they're necessarily any publishing company's top thing to publish. And I just wonder how hard was that process?
Yeah, no, I'll happily share the experience, because I think, especially the way I'll frame it, I'll try to, I think it can be learned from in case anyone's listening, they're trying to pitch a project. I got lucky with this project in the sense that I was able to do it because I had worked with Pushkin Press, led by the fantastic Adam Freudenheim, very intelligent, very cosmopolitan publisher. And I had done several projects with them. And so we knew each other. There was a working relationship. We'd work quite happily. What had happened also is that they had published an anthology that did really well. And so, publishers, I think, wash, rinse, and repeat a lot of times is their motto. So if something's worked, they're likely to do it again, meaning that, because they'd done an anthology that was successful, when I brought up the subject and my pitch, they were very welcoming to it. I mean, one of the things, strangely enough, is that I've always been told or asked, it's been framed as a question sometimes, but, what a wonderfully relevant topic this is. This is such a great timing for exile, which I'm sure helped in, finding a publisher. But I think, there's never been a bad time to talk about exile in the sense that, it's always been a concern. So I think for some reason now there's this perception that there's a lot more exile or rootlessness or displacement than there was before. But, we've really been dealing with it as far as back as we know. So putting it together was relatively easy from that point of view. I think if to anyone out there who wants to put together a similar book or something along those lines, I would recommend building on relationships and also using better known names to help you along. I think that can also be a good way that more established names can help people that aren't being given much of a platform or voice. So and it's something that I'd happily do. So if anyone's watching this and they want to talk about exile or work on projects, I'm happy to give some tips or advice. And I'm, as most of us these days, I'm easily trackable on the internet.
Your last name it's not like a Cook or Smith or something. It's a lot easier to find you than some people. Last question, André, random. Do you think there's going to be an election in November in the US?
Well, I hope so. I hope that there will be an election. I think I'm definitely not alone in that. I dare say that despite my pessimism these days, I like to think that there's a majority of people leading that way. They want an election. They want change. The voter suppression I'm seeing is making me deeply uncomfortable. And once again, we're seeing the pandemic explain. You know what? I think the capital uses every part of the buffalo, right? And so they are unwilling to let go of this wonderful opportunity to push back on every front, whether it's firing people, whether it's cutting salaries, whether it's taking away labor rights, whether it's taking away elections. So yeah. Not a very hopeful note to end on, but
no, but
I think
it's a mixed bag of a time. I mean, some people may be feeling hopeful, and there's a lot of reason to feel hopeful and a lot of reason to feel very pessimistic as well. And I guess that precipices are like that.
Yeah, but also, you know what? Let me actually go for a hopeful note, and this is based on, we're really talking about seeing the uprising, the protests here. I don't trust the elections to be held or for voters not to be suppressed, but I do trust those kids out there, and I trust the movements out on the streets. I like what I'm seeing. I like the smiles on their faces. I like their ideas, and all power to them.
Yeah.
So I place my trust in them, and I think that that's well earned and deserved.
André, Naffis-Sahely, thank you so much for joining us for the hour on Fifth Estate Live. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, David. It was a real honor and pleasure to talk to you. And thank you to the rest of the team too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for tuning in to my discussion with André Naffis-Sahely for Fifth Estate Live, which you can hear every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and elsewhere. You'll find all the Fifth Estate Live episodes at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the physical magazine or read the latest edition online. You can also find these interviews and my other interviews archived in various places in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovix and in audio form at soundcloud.com/davidrovix, at patreon.com/davidrovix, where you can also support my broadcasting efforts and check out lots of other content. Or if you look for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with author and organizer, co-founder of Popular Resistance, Kevin Zeese from Baltimore, Maryland. On Saturday, July 4th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. GMT, I will be having a one-man release party in my living room for my new album, Notes from a Failed State, which is now up on Spotify and all the other usual music streaming platforms. The album release party will happen right here on whatever platform you're watching on. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now. See you soon.